Good morning. My name is Alex Hazel. I'm Professor of Obstetrics at the University of Manchester and a consultant obstetrician at St Mary's Hospital. And I would like to tell you today a little story really about the minus case control study and how this moved from an idea to creating impact and changing some of the advice that we give women in pregnancy. I think the first thing to say is I'm just one person of a really big team that conducted this study, and hopefully that will become apparent as we go through the talk. So back when we began the minor study, the UK had one of the highest stillbirth rates in Europe. About 1 in 250 pregnancies ended in stillbirth after 28 weeks of pregnancy. And actually, before we started the study, the rate hadn't really declined significantly, despite advances in maternity care. You can see here is one of the graphs that was published in the Lancet Stillbirth series in 2011. And you can see stillbirth rates from 1990 through to 2008. You can see actually in the UK, this is us at the top of the graph, and really very stable rates for the preceding decade. You can see other countries like the Netherlands here in green were actually going down during the same time frame. So the Lancet Stillbirth series had a call to action, and there were 3 things that were aimed. So to reduce third trimester stillbirth rates to less than 5 per 1,000 births, well actually we still met that. To close equity gaps and to eliminate all preventable stillbirths. So we were managing the first, but not the second. And so we began to think about how do you try and prevent stillbirth? I developed this conceptual model where we try and think about understanding risk factors and causes. And we can do that by research, but also through audit and investigations after stillbirth and confidential inquiries. And then we're able to think about developing interventions, and then we try and make an evidence base. We try and implement that, and ultimately to see whether we're able to prevent stillbirth, and we need audits to be able to do that. So this creates a cycle where we're able to see whether our interventions improve outcome. So when we started the study, there were lots of risk factors known for stillbirth, many of which are still, relevant in our clinical practice today. So advanced maternal age, particularly women over the age of 40, women who are morbidly obese, women sadly from non-white ethnicity, women who smoke cigarettes, not engaging with antenatal care, of women who have low socioeconomic status, and then things that change in pregnancy, so reduced fetal movements or small gestational age, and also women with a history of stillbirth. The problem is that actually most of these risk factors have a modest effect size, so their risk factor goes up by about 2-fold, and actually some of them we can't even modify. We can't change someone's ethnicity, we can't change someone's age when they come to see us, so this gives us a bit of a problem. However, there are some important modifiable risk factors. So the most obvious one of those is smoking. And in Greater Manchester particularly, there's been a huge amount of work done to try and stop smoking in pregnancy and providing really robust stop smoking services. And this is part of a really important part of the Saving Babies Lives Care Bundle. So we've got messages on cigarette packets, we have adverts, we have defined support packages to try and stop people from smoking. So we do accept there are some of these risk factors that are modifiable and they're worth investing in. Now in 2011 there was a study called the Auckland Stillbirth Study, and this was determined to determine whether there are modifiable risk factors for late stillbirth. And between 2006 to 2009, in Auckland, they identified 155 cases of late stillbirth after 28 weeks and 310 gestational age match controls. And their actual primary hypothesis was that sleep disordered breathing, so women who had obstructive sleep apnea and also maternal sleep position, would be associated with increased risk of late stillbirth. And this paper was published in the BMJ. By first author was Thomasina Stacey. Thomasina is a Brit who was actually out in Auckland and the rest of the team were all based in Auckland. So actually, this was one of the first studies that reported a relationship between maternal sleep practice and the risk of late stillbirth. And they found that women who did not go to sleep on their left side had a twofold increased risk of stillbirth. And women who got up to the toilet once or less during the night were also at increased risk there if you slept for longer in that position. And you can see here that they found, compared to left-sided sleeping, right-sided sleeping was about a twofold increased risk, and going to sleep laid flat on your back was about a threefold increased risk. Now, this study, when it came out, caused quite a lot of controversy. It was presented at the British Maternal Fetal Medicine Society meeting. I can remember there were lots and lots of questions. And actually, one of the things that happened is I said to the team that I was a bit sceptical about their findings. And their response was, well, why don't you do it then? Why don't you see what happens if you do it in the UK? We need it to be validated in another population. Let's have a look. And so working with them, we developed the study idea back in 2012. We then applied to wellbeing of women, and it got knocked back. We applied to funding to a New Zealand charity called Cure Kids, who'd been involved with the Auckland Stillbirth study, and a charity in the UK called Action Medical Research, and we were fortunate enough to be awarded that grant in 2013. Our study setup started in September 2013, and we had our first recruit in April 2014. We had a funded extension to enable us to recruit more people in 2015, and we completed recruitment in March 2016. And we have been doing analysis on the data set since September 2016, and we're still doing bits of work on that. And the papers have been submitted from April 2017 onwards. So you can see, even between the first idea being developed and the papers being submitted, there is a 5-year lag time. So our aims within MINUS were to identify modifiable risk factors for late stillbirth. In particular, we wanted to confirm or refute the findings regarding maternal sleep factors identified by the Auckland Stillbirth study and a second smaller one called the Sydney Stillbirth study. And we wanted to clarify the relationship between modifiable factors and risk of late stillbirth, and also to think whether there was any interaction between the maternal variables, infant factors, and the risk of late stillbirth. So, for example, is it a baby that is small for gestational age that is most vulnerable to supine sleep? And that increases the risk of late stillbirth. And so to do that, we needed to have a bigger study. So we had, before you start the study, it's really important that you write your hypotheses down. You think about what the questions you're trying to answer. Now, this talk is going to really focus on the sleep position. So I've focused on those, but we did have other hypotheses too. We thought that going to sleep laid on your left reduces the risk of late stillbirth. And conversely, if you go to sleep laid flat on your back, it increases it. We also thought that maybe if you sleep for longer, and sleeping in the day would increase the risk of late stillbirth, because that's what was also seen in the Auckland Stillbirth study, that having reduced fetal movements before the baby dies increases the risk of stillbirth. And we thought there would be an interaction between sleep position and prolonged sleep. And lastly, that non-left sleep position in conjunction with a compromised baby further increases the risk of late stillbirth. So before we started, we did a power calculation, and we realised that we needed about 291 cases of stillbirth to detect an odds ratio of about 2. So, which is what the other risk factors usually have. Now, there are different ways of doing this. And in an ideal way, ideal world, we just think of a cohort study where we take a whole population, we get all of the information on all of them, and then ultimately we look at the differences between mums who have a stillbirth and mums who have a live birth. Now, the problem with doing that is we would need to recruit about 300,000 women to be able to get the follow-up we would need to get 291 cases of stillbirth. So that isn't going to be viable. So therefore, we did a case control study. So we took 291 cases and 582 controls from centres all over the Midlands and north of England, because we have higher stillbirth rates in that area of the country. And participants were interviewed face-to-face and a questionnaire was completed. Now, we had a diverse team. There was myself, who was the chief investigator, Thomasina Stacey, who had come back by that point, and she was in mid-Yorkshire. Bill Martin, who's a lovely consultant at Birmingham Women's. Devenda Roberts was a consultant obstetrician at Liverpool Women's. And then we had the team, the original team from Auckland, steering and helping us. And then we had Jane Budd, who was a lead research midwife for the study. So you can see here that we had study sites all over the Midlands and north of England. We had some wannabe people down on the south coast and in Berkshire. And we published the protocol in 2014. And so one of the things that we were trying to do was to make this as methodologically rigorous as possible. And so we wrote down our aims and hypotheses and our methods so people could see what we were going to do before we did it. So just to explain a little bit about a case control study. So it's really good for rare outcomes like stillbirth. So what you do is you take cases, so people with the disease, and controls, so people who don't have the disease, in this case, women who had a live-born baby and the baby was alive at the time of interview. Now, they all completed a questionnaire. It was quite a long questionnaire, and it was researcher administered, so the research midwives helped the participants complete the questionnaire. And then what you do is you work out whether women were or weren't exposed to a risk factor. So let's say cigarette smoking. So of the cases, there were 4 times more people exposed to smoking than in the control population. And then you look who wasn't exposed. And therefore, you can then use that information to calculate an odds ratio, so an element, a measure of risk and association between the outcome and the exposure. Now, it's not a perfect study design, and as I said, the cohort study design would be better, but it's actually a pragmatic way of undertaking this study. So cases are women who had a late stillbirth after 28 weeks of gestation, and controls are women who were recruited at the same gestation as the profile of stillbirths in those units in the preceding 3 years. It was only singleton pregnancies who didn't have fetal anomalies, and women had to be over 16 years of age and able to give informed consent. And as I said before, the data was collected using a researcher-administered questionnaire. And you can see on the flowchart, we had to approach an awful lot of women. So we had to approach 660 cases. We couldn't contact 77 of them. 583 here received the study information. 296 decided to complete the questionnaire. But actually, at post-mortem, 5 cases had a lethal congenital anomaly that hadn't been diagnosed beforehand. So we were able to include 291 stillbirths. And then healthy controls, there were a lot more. So there were 2,830 potential controls, 2,147 received the study information, 734 agreed to participate. Sadly, one of those mums had a stillbirth after her interview, so we had to exclude her, and then that left us with 733 controls. So our study was approximately twice as big as the Auckland stillbirth study and 3 times as big as the Sydney stillbirth study. And in the questionnaire, we asked lots and lots of different questions. So we asked about demographics, women's general health and past medical history, the outcomes of their previous pregnancies, the information about the beginning of this pregnancy, including things like IVF, fertility treatment, medication that was taken. We asked about their diet. We asked about their personal habits and sleep practices, fecal movements, injury and family violence, and exercise, and specific questions about when the baby died in the case of women that had a stillbirth. Now, this was the biggest study I'd ever been involved with at the time, and it was quite daunting when you looked at this graph without the recruitment target, without the final data on it. So you can see that we needed to steadily recruit cases, about 30 cases a month over the time frame of the study, and also controls. Now, interestingly, we actually thought that controls would be the tricky group to recruit, and it didn't actually work out that way. We were always ahead of the target on our control recruits, and you can see it just took us a little bit longer to recruit cases, and we learnt an awful lot from trying to carry out this study. So overall, because there were more controls than cases, the recruitment rate was about 45% of cases and 26% of eligible controls, and that was lower than our existing Auckland stillbirth study and Sydney stillbirth studies, but these were largely single centre studies, and the work was done by one expert research midwife rather than working with 40 different participating units and having to train staff. So the controls, the median gestation at interview was 36 weeks and 3 days, and for cases it was 37 weeks and 4 days, so it was slightly different. The median time between the date of diagnosing stillbirth and the mum's presumed date of stillbirth was 0 days, so we think mum's perception was accurate, and the time between the date of diagnosis and stillbirth and interview was a median of 25 days. It was as little as the interquartile range was as little as 17 days up to as many as 35, but a lot of that is limited by when people could face doing the interview emotionally. And you can see the causes of stillbirth were very much as you would expect. The bulk of cases were due to fetal growth restriction or placental insufficiency, and in about 1 in 7 cases there was no relevant condition identified. So this is very typical of the UK stillbirth distribution of causes. You can see that women participated throughout the whole of the reproductive spectrum, from under 20 years to over 40 years. Women who were, we had 80% of our population were white, but there were participants from Black and Indian groups as well. The nulliparous women had an increased risk of late stillbirth, as did women with high parity, and this is consistent with previous data, and also women who had no formal education. And as expected, women who had a small for gestational age baby had an increased risk of late stillbirth, and also interestingly those that were in the lower half of centile, so between the 10th centile and the 50th percentile. And this probably reflects that there are some babies who aren't small for gestational age but who do have fetal growth restriction. So our data that we got from the sleep position and duration were really quite consistent with what we'd seen first in the Auckland stillbirth study. So you can see in this bottom group here, the going to sleep position in the night before the interview. If you laid to sleep supine compared to going to sleep in the left position, you had a 2.3-fold increased risk of late stillbirth. If you only went up to the toilet once, then you had a 2.8-fold increased risk, and if you had very short or very short sleep was associated with late stillbirth, as was a tendency to have naps every single day. So you can try and work out the significance of those results by looking at the odds ratio and then multiplying it by the percent population exposed to generate this thing called a population attributable risk. And you can see the population attributable risks for other common issues relating to stillbirth. The biggest is small for gestational age. If we could manage that properly and effectively, actually there would be the population attributable risk of that is 45%. So there would be a very significant reduction in stillbirth if we could prevent these babies from dying. However, supine going to sleep position was about 4%. So it's a small contribution, but we think it's a relevant one. And so we then went on to compare it with our findings with published data. And you can see at the bottom that actually the multivariate odds ratios for supine sleep are all relatively modest, but they're all in the same region, and the confidence intervals very definitely overlap. And you can see here then on this forest plot, so this is the line of no effect at all, this black line here, and this is supine sleep, and you can see the pooled risk is about 2.6 in this aggregate data meta-analysis of supine sleep compared to left-sided sleep. So what we then need to work out, this is an observational study. Observation and association don't equal causation. So what can we do to try and understand that better? Well, there was an epidemiologist called Sir Austin Bradford Hill, and he produced these criteria to think about whether your association may be causative. So it's interesting that in terms of preventable stillbirth, that we know that, that altering the position of a baby reduces the risk of SIDS, that we weren't able to look at any biological gradient, so we can't say if you spend more time supine, the outcome is worse. But there is coherent effects and consistent effects. So we'd seen the same thing in 4 case control studies, and the effect size was similar in those that we were able to compare. Interestingly, New Zealand had run a little bit with their information, and they have begun to see a reduction in late stillbirth rate. It's biologically plausible, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. The relationship goes in the right order. So you go to sleep supine before the stillbirth occurs. So in terms of thinking about mechanism, well, we think that it really is very similar to what happens when women are laid supine in labour, which is not a good position to be in. And if you think about when we have a fetal bradycardia, what is the first thing we do if a mum is laid supine? It is that we should move her into the left lateral position. And the reason we do that is because maternal cardiac output is best on left, worst supine, and intermediate on the right hand side in late pregnancy. And fetal oxygen saturation, you see similar changes. So the fetal oxygen saturation is lowest when laid supine. And that all goes back to anatomy. Because you remember that your inferior vena cava, which has got a thin wall, is at the back of your abdomen, and we think that you get aortocaval compression when laid supine. And interestingly, we think going to sleep position is the most important, because the position that you go to sleep in is the position that you hold for the longest part in the night. So the arguments we're making are biologically plausible. And then Peter Stone, who's the professor of obstetrics in Auckland, who actually wasn't involved in the Auckland stillbirth study, Peter showed that when looking at fetal behavioural state, which is a method of analysing long CTG recordings, they showed that when the mum is supine, the fetus is more likely to adopt quiet sleep compared to active states. And this is thought because this is an oxygen sparing position, so the baby is adapting to maternal supine state. So that data was all well and good. We had agreement between international studies, and then we had to think about what were we going to try and do. And so actually all of the investigators of the different studies came together to do something called an individual patient data meta-analysis, which is a really powerful tool. And individual patient data meta-analysis isn't the same as the aggregate data meta-analysis that I've just shown you. What we do is we take the data from the studies, and we almost make a single big study population again. So you have, and then you redo your analysis, and that means that you can adjust your analysis for potential confounding factors and look for interactions, but in a much bigger data set. So when we, again, you go back, you publish the protocol, it was a real privilege to work with this team. And this time we had 851 cases and 2,257 controls. And when we did the individual patient data meta-analysis, which was led by Leslie McCowan and Robin Cronin, who was a research midwife in Auckland, we found that when you pooled the odds, you get the risk of having a late stillbirth after supine going to sleep position is about 2.63 compared to the left-hand side. And actually, when we pulled all the data, one of the really important things was that the right side was similar to the left. There was no statistically significant association. Interestingly, we didn't see any interactions between going to sleep position and indicators of fetal vulnerability, including being small and maternal cigarette smoking. So this tells us that women who smoke cigarettes, for example, are more likely to go to sleep supine. So it's not it's a real independent association rather than measuring a confounder. You can see that obesity came quite close to statistical significance, and again, this may be because reflecting on the potential mechanism of action, it may be that women who are obese have a greater load and greater aortocapal compression. And again, actually, the population attributable risk was nearly 6% in this analysis. So what did we do? Well, we then went on to think about how we disseminate the study findings. The first thing we did, actually, we put them out for peer review. We sent them to the British Journal of Obs and Gynae, who were running a special issue on stillbirth. And we then had the confidence that other people had seen the findings, they interpreted the data, and they were accepted for publication. We actually also went to experts in the field. So we spoke to people like Gordon Smith from Cambridge, Jenny Korinchik at the National Perinatal Epidemiology Unit to seek their advice about what we felt we should do. And one of the things they said we should do is we should tell women, because we're never going to test a randomized controlled trial to see whether this prevents stillbirth. And that they felt the results were so consistent and so robust that we ought to do something. So we worked with Tommy's and NHS England to make this short video to summarise the research findings that we had. And this campaign, Tommy's did some brilliant work seeing whether it increased awareness. And what they found is that that women had a better understanding that they shouldn't go to sleep on their back, about a 21% increase in awareness before and after the campaign. Also that you can other things to try and support that, like using pillows and things. So then after the NICE revamped their antenatal care guidelines that were published in 2021, there was new information included about sleep position. And so it said that we should advise women to avoid going to sleep on their backs after 28 weeks of pregnancy, and to consider using pillows to maintain their position while sleeping, and explain to the woman that there may be a link between going to sleep on her back and stillbirth in late pregnancy. And NICE carry out a evidence assessment about how to evidence why they've made the decision that they have. And you can see here that the studies that they included Robin Cronin's systematic review with an IPD meta-analysis, and also the 4 case control studies that we've talked about. And they said that they drew this conclusion because there was high quality evidence from an IPD meta-analysis of 5 case control studies, which found an important association between supine gained sleep position and stillbirth. And that came out 10 years after we had the idea for the study. So these things don't change quickly. They're an immense amount of work from a huge number of people to produce the evidence that then makes it into guidelines. There are also published data from MINUS as well as on sleep position. There's data about perception of fetal activity, the importance of screening for gestational diabetes, the impact of social factors, particularly deprivation and intimate partner violence, of caffeine intake in pregnancy. And we have just submitted a paper to BJOG, to the special edition on environment and maternal health, to look at the association of air pollution and stillbirth. And also we looked at women's perceptions of their participation. So the items there in red are other items that have been cited in guidelines and practice statements. So, for example, we're now educating women across Greater Manchester, and the RCM produced a really nice package that women should reduce their caffeine in pregnancy. We're currently updating the RCOG guideline to reflect issues around maternal perception of fetal movements. And so where next? Well, one of the things that we're about to start, and hopefully that you will see in the hospitals in which you're working, is that we're now doing MINUS 20 to 28, which is funded by the NIHR Research and Patient Benefit scheme. And we've renamed it because we don't want it to just be restricted now to the Midlands and north of England. But what we want to do now is to try and understand modifiable risk factors for stillbirth between 20 and 28 weeks of pregnancy, in the same way that MINUS enabled us to do for late stillbirths after 28 weeks. So what we're hoping is we can continue to refine and improve the evidence base that we have to prevent stillbirths. I would really like to acknowledge all of the women who participated, both those whose babies died and those who were willing to spend their time in their pregnancy to prevent other babies from dying in the future. Also Jane Budd, who was an incredibly committed study midwife. She really took MINUS to her heart and did a huge amount of work. There were you may well have been involved as obstetricians or midwives in your units, and also you can't do studies without funding, and that makes a huge difference. So I hope that gives you a little bit of an idea about how long it takes to move something from an idea into clinical practice, and some of the steps along the way, and also, most importantly, to inspire you to get involved in some research. Now, that doesn't mean that you need to be a PI like me, or Lucy, or some of the other excellent researchers that you're going to see today. But it really means that all of us can recruit participants, can contribute to this research that hopefully will reduce stillbirth for years to come. So thanks very much for listening, and I hope you have a great day, and all Lucy's organisation comes off. Thanks ever so much.